We are here today to discuss the issue of migrant worker abuse and human trafficking in Thailand's fishing industry. I'm joined today by Phil Robertson, Deputy Director of Human Rights Watch's Asia Division. Could you give us a brief overview of the evolution of Thailand's fishing industry in relation to human trafficking?
Okay. Well, Thailand's fishing industry for many years was dependent on seasonal migrant labor, particularly from the Northeast.
Okay.
And this is back in the 1980s, and that was when those fisheries were primarily concentrated in the Gulf of Thailand.
Okay.
This is when fish stocks in the Gulf of Thailand were still quite significant. Going back to 1989, there was a major typhoon, Typhoon Gay, that caught the Thai fishing fleets at sea.
Okay.
And hundreds of fishing boats were sunk. Hundreds and perhaps thousands of Thai fishermen were killed. And, you can talk to Northeastern families, and a lot of people lost relatives at that time.
Okay.
At that point, people said, okay, it's too dangerous to go into these fishing boats, and other job opportunities opened up. This was 88, 89. This is when the Thai economy really started taking off, and, there's a lot of onshore jobs that were coming up. And so, the people from the Northeast decided to vote with their feet and essentially leave the fishing industry and move to other occupations.
Okay.
What this left was the fishing boats without adequate labor. And that's when they then turned to migrant workers from other countries, particularly from Burma and from Cambodia.
Okay.
And what has happened over the period of years is these boats, as the Gulf of Thailand was fished out, were searching for new areas to exploit. And so you've had a growth of overseas fishing going to concessions in Malaysia, to Indonesia, and even further out to the coasts of Yemen and going out the other way towards Africa from Somalia. You had these migrant workers coming onto these boats, but they didn't want to go out on those long voyages. And so this is where the trafficking has started, where these boats didn't have enough workers to voluntarily go out on these fishing trips. And so now they've essentially, if you're running short, if you say you have to have 20 or 30 people to take a boat out and you only have 15, what you have is then a network of brokers who are presenting trafficked persons at ports that are then being purchased by fishing boat captains.
Could you explain what the role of government regulation is in the fishing industry?
Well, right now, government regulation in the fishing industry is hardly present. The existing legal regulations connected to, for instance, the Labor Protection Act of 1998, because of a ministerial regulation number 10 issued under that act, any boat that goes overseas for more than a year outside of Thai territorial waters, or any boat that has less than 20 workers on it, is not covered by the Labor Protection Act.
Okay.
So you have this basically massive exemption, which people have now agreed needs to be revised. There was discussions after the revelations about the trafficking on the fishing boats, and people saying, okay, this has to be revised. But it's been more than 5 or 6 years since the discussion was had about revising that regulation, and still nothing has come out of that from the Ministry of Labor. In other areas of regulation connected to the fishing fleets, the existing laws date back to the 1940s, at a time when there weren't any overseas fishing fleets. So the existing laws are completely out of date in terms of regulating the Thai fishing fleets. And frankly, this is the way the fishing boat owners and the captains have wanted it. They basically have been left on their own to regulate themselves. And that's part of why we've arrived at this situation where there's so many abuses in the fishing industry.
Okay. And could you explain the current judicial process to prosecute traffickers if they are caught, and is it effective or not?
Well, if a person is, of course, identified as a trafficking victim, and there is an identification process that is an interagency process at the provincial level. If they found their trafficking victim and the police decide to identify a suspect and decide to prosecute, then prosecutions can take place under the Anti-Trafficking Act of 2007.
Okay.
But often it doesn't happen because the processes take a long time, and the persons who are trafficking victims are expected to essentially stay in Thai government shelters for the duration of that process. And, that could be a year, that could be 2 years. Migrant workers come to Thailand to make money. Their ability to do so is limited in the shelters. Now they're allowed to work, but it's still can be quite limiting. And people want freedom of movement. They don't want to have their life on hold for a year or 2 years. And so it's been difficult for the government to obtain cooperation from the trafficking victims, one. But two, also, there's been a failure by the police and by other authorities to effectively investigate human trafficking crimes.
And what are some possible plausible alternatives to the current labor recruitment practices?
Well, my view about it, the way that they should set up the migrant worker registration process is they should say to a migrant worker, okay, we want you to work in Thailand. We're going to have you registered. You're going to go through a health check, and then you'll be given a period of time when you can work. It could be 3 years or it could be 5 years. And you will have the same rights as any other worker to give your work to a particular employer or to change employers. There's just to be mobility and transferability of employers. That way a migrant worker can essentially pick and choose who they want to work for, rather than being bound by that employer because of the registration requirement. What that would mean is you would get the labor market, to work in essence in line with better labor practices, because abusive employers would become known to the migrants, and no one would want to go to work with them. They would essentially be looking for better employers, and those employers with the worst labor practices would have a hard time recruiting anybody, and ultimately might be forced out of business. And that would be a sort of a market outcome that would be in line with improving labor standards, rather than the current system where workers are bound to a specific employer and the employer can treat them any way they want.
What role do both trade partners and consumers play in combating human trafficking in the Thai seafood industry?
Well, this is a significant area of interest right now. Thailand is under a lot of pressure because of this fishing industry, and also because of its seafood processing industry from overseas customers. For instance, recently, the major brands, for instance, like in the U.S., like Costco or Carrefour in Europe, or Tesco, are all now giving much more scrutiny to Thai seafood products because of some of these exposés on human trafficking. The Guardian newspaper just came out with a very well-researched exposé finding that essentially trash fish that is caught using forced and trafficked labor on fishing boats is ending up in factories that are then producing shrimp meal.
Okay.
And that shrimp meal is then fed to shrimp in shrimp ponds, and those shrimp are then exported to Europe and to North America, essentially making that supply chain something that is based on, in some ways, traffic labor, which is, of course, a no-no for these major retailers who are buying these shrimp. So recently we've seen a lot of pressure coming on companies like Charan Pokpahan, CP, from these overseas customers, demanding that CP get on top of this situation. And more trade pressure coming on Thailand from other partners to address this situation. So I think that's quite positive. I think that corporate social responsibility connected to trade should demand answers from Thailand, should demand accountability from Thailand to ensure that trafficked persons are not on fishing boats, catching fish that then going into supply chains producing goods for export.
And can you tell us a little bit about Human Rights Watch's work in combating human trafficking in the fishing industry?
Well, we have been commenting on this for quite some time. We're very concerned about abuses against persons, whether they be done by governments or by individuals or by companies. Prior to joining Human Rights Watch, I did a number of research projects looking at the issue of trafficking into the fishing industry, including a report that was written for the International Organization for Migration. And much of the work we're doing follows on that report I did from IOM, based on my knowledge of the actual situation and what's happening on these boats. And so Human Rights Watch, we've been continually concerned about the abuses of migrants that we have uncovered, both at sea and on land in Thailand. And the work on the fishing aspects of this and the issue of human trafficking. I mean, this is really sort of the worst kind of abuses that you would see. It is a situation that is intolerable, and we continue to demand that the Thai government take action to clean this up, and keep hoping that they will do so. The interesting thing about that IOM report, which is online at the IOM website, is that the report went up through the formal consideration process of the Thai government. It was considered by a subcommittee on human trafficking in the fishing industry that was operating under the National Anti-Trafficking Committee, and then was considered, at a major interagency meeting at the government house with a deputy prime minister in the chair, where they basically reviewed the report. IOM made a presentation about what it was, and it was essentially accepted as a report for action by the Thai government. So that's what's happened so far, but there hasn't been any action. Essentially, these documents, these recommendations, they go up the line, and then nothing happens. And that's the central problem here. There's got to be political will by the Thai government in all its various different agencies and ministries to address this in a comprehensive way. The recommendations are there. People have seen what needs to be done. Now the question is, will they do it?
Thailand's Ministry of Foreign Affairs actually issued several press releases reaffirming Thailand's commitment to combating these issues. One such statement said the National Council of Peace and Order is preparing to improve and adjust related rules and procedures to facilitate the working process. Given those statements and Thailand's role in this, have there been any new advancements since June in this arena by the Thai government?
We haven't seen them yet.
Okay.
I mean, NCPO says it's going to do things, but waiting to see the details of what they're actually prepared to propose.
Okay.
I mean, they could play a very significant role in bringing pressure to bear to clean up the Thai fishing industry.
Okay.
But so far, we haven't seen that.
Okay.
The Thai fishing industry is very influential, to be honest. There's a lot of key people within that industry who are, either connected into the political world or, provide support or assistance to the political parties. And so it's not going to be easy for the Thai government to get a hold on the fishing industry. They have essentially remained outside of effective regulation, whether it be on registration of boats, registration of workers on those boats, when they come, when they go. All these things have essentially been outside of effective government regulation for a long time, and they certainly don't want to see more regulation. And it's up to the Thai government now to demonstrate the political will to tackle the problem of human trafficking on these boats once and for all, because it's been talked about enough. The information is there about what is happening. Now is the time for action.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Phil. Until next time, this is Jess with Thai Law Forum.